I want to welcome everyone to this presentation, Will County During the Civil War, hosted by the Joliet Junior College Library. I want to thank everyone for being here today. My name is Amy Cellino, and I am a librarian at Joliet Junior College. We are thrilled to have Professor Dennis Doyle here with us today. Professor Doyle teaches history and sociology at JJC. He is a proud former JJC student athlete on the football team. He graduated from Colorado State University and holds a master's degree in history from American University and a master's in sociology from DePaul University. Professor Doyle speaks often on Civil War history to many groups around the country, including future presentations scheduled in Wisconsin, Chicago, and Colorado. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A via the chat where I will be moderating. Please join me in welcoming Professor Doyle. Yay.
Well, thank you. Welcome again, everyone, to my presentation on Will County and the Civil War. Thank you to Amy for setting this up. I spoke last year to the library on the history of elections in the United States in October of 2020. And I also talked about voter suppression as well, the history of voter suppression, which is quite extensive in the United States history. So again, thank you so much. This is a great topic. I am a Civil War historian, and I do speak often on this topic. I do speak about multiple topics on the Civil War, from race issues to more of the military science behind it. And so this is a great topic called the Will County during the American Civil War. We have a very long history of Civil War history from Will County. You'll see that in my presentation. And I also look forward to any Q&A after my presentation. So please save your questions for then, and I would be more than happy to answer your questions you have. As you can see, this is Abraham Lincoln, who was born in Kentucky, but obviously lived in Illinois for most of his life. He briefly lived in Indiana as well. This is in Washington, D.C. It is a magnificent memorial. It really is dedicated to the principles of this country, to the better angels of our being, as Lincoln would say. Not too long ago, I was at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home in Virginia. And again, the great contradictions of American democracy. We have this beautiful Constitution. We have these Bill of Rights. And certainly Lincoln was a slave owner. Jefferson was a slave owner. And certainly during Lincoln's time, slavery was the definitive topic. And by 1860, Lincoln had to deal with the consequences of the United States and the powers that be, kind of ignoring the topic of slavery to some degree. And of course, the Constitution is ratified in 1790. So we're talking 1860, 70 years of the issue of slavery and other human rights being finally coming to the forefront. So I always like to start my presentation with Lincoln Memorial, and many of you have been there. You know what a beautiful place that is as well. I want to give you a quick quote by a gentleman who lived in our area, who fought in the 100th Illinois. His name is Dan Higgins. He says, "We live in the glorious present and we look forward to a glorious future of everything we hold dear." Now look at this. Here is Dan Higgins of the 100th Illinois Infantry. It's 1911. He's about 71 years old. Now 71 is not that old in our time frame of 2021. I mean, it's not 19, but it's not extremely old either. In his day, 71 was getting up there. I mean, you were getting to be a pretty old person by then. Maybe someone we might say today is 91. And yet, look what he's saying. We live in the glorious present. We're alive. Our friends, many of our friends died in the Civil War. They didn't make it. They did not get to grow into middle age, into old age, like we have. This was in Lockport. Many of you are familiar with Lockport, obviously, being in Will County. Maybe some of you grew up in Lockport or went to Lockport High School. We have a Will County Historical Museum in Lockport. We have the I&M Canal is in Lockport. So Lockport's a very historical town, founded around the 1830s. And yet, this man who is a blacksmith, he's saying everything that we hold dear. In other words, what is he saying at this meeting of his friends who are all aging in 1911? that we fought this war for future generations. What we hold dear is our freedom. What we hold dear is what we fought for. We held the country together in the Civil War. We ended the Confederacy. We ended slavery. We hold that dear. And we gave people a glorious future. What a magnificent quote. I actually found this at the Will County Historical Museum in Lockport. What an interesting man Dan Higgins was as well. He died in 1926. There's the flag of the 100th Illinois Regiment, Infantry Regiment. It is at the Joliet Area Historical Museum. It is if you've been there and you've seen it, it is a large flag. This was their battle flag. This is an original flag. This was actually a picture I took before they raised it. You can see there's like a couple of ladders next to it. I took this back around 2015, right before they were going to raise it, and at the museum. So it's a beautiful museum. And of course, it's a beautiful flag, and that is the battle flag. What that flag could talk. And Dan Higgins, he was in the 100th Illinois for 3 years. It was an infantry regiment that we'll talk about in a little bit. So a little bit of history. Illinois in 1860, about 1.7 million people lived in Illinois in 1860. Today, it's about 13 million. About 280,000 Illinoisans will serve in the United States Army and Navy during the Civil War from Illinois. So that's a very large number. Think of that percent. So 280,000 Illinoisans will serve in the war. The population of Chicago in 1860 was about 100,000. Today, it's about 2.6 million. The Will County population was about a little under 30,000. Today, it's 800,000. So Will County is, and it's still growing, as we know, Will County. The Joliet population in 1860 was about 9,200 people. Today, it's 180,000. And the Will County economy in 1860 was a very large producer of agriculture, which we still are today. Even though we have 800,000 people in Will County, we still have a pretty large agricultural producing county. And of course, we had a very large industrial manufacturing base, primarily in Joliet in 1860. And a lot of it had to do with the brand new technology of the railroad industry, which was only about 20 or 30 years old by 1860. But the steam engine, the railroads, which were actually invented in England, the first railroad in the United States was in Baltimore in 1829. And it was, again, it just revolutionized technology, it revolutionized the economy. It also increased the speed that we can move goods. And Joliet was really the hub of that. Just like we see today, Joliet is the hub of transportation. If you don't believe me, drive down I-80 sometime and let me know how you think about transportation in Joliet. And for those of you who live in the area, that was a bad joke. I'm sorry. I live in Joliet. All right. Again, if you lived in the United States in the 1850s, it was a very, very contentious time. The 1850s were really a decade of struggle in this country. The issue of slavery was growing to the point where it was almost not containable through law and policy anymore in the United States. It was a very wedge issue in this country. We also started seeing a lot of Irish and German immigrants coming to the United States. In the 1840s and 1850s, there was a lot of upheaval in Europe at that time. You had the Irish famine in 1847. And of course, you had the German Revolution of 1848. So you see two large groups of European immigrants coming to the United States. And that was relatively new to the United States to have large immigrant groups. And of course, today, 2021, we still talk a lot about immigration and what does it mean to be an immigrant to the United States? What is the legal process of immigration? And of course, also the stereotypes and discrimination towards people who immigrate to the United States, both then and now. Obviously, my last name is Doyle. I am the product of Irish immigration on my father's side, certainly. So these are all issues that really were coming to a forefront by 1860. And of course, the American economy was industrializing in the North. We were expanding out west. California and Oregon were newly acquired states into the Union. Both of them were free states. They were not slaveholding states. And so the 1850s was a very contentious time in American history. And it really came to a forefront in the 1860 election with Lincoln. Lincoln vowed to end the expansion of slavery, but not ending slavery at that time. Lincoln was not a supporter of slavery, nor was he his whole life. Lincoln was a very popular man in Illinois. He did win the state in the 1860 election. He ran against an Illinoisan, another Illinoisan who's actually from Vermont, and that's Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was a senator from Illinois. He was a very, very popular man in this country. He actually beat Lincoln in the 1858 senatorial race. So Lincoln is going up against a person who he had lost to in a very important race in 1858 in Illinois with a senatorial seat. Stephen Douglas was a magnificent politician in terms of his skill. He was quite a conservative person, but as a politician, he had tremendous political skill, and Lincoln was able to outmaneuver him politically. And he did win the state of Illinois by 2.5%, which is a relatively close vote. In Will County, we have 102 counties in Illinois. Will County was very pro-Lincoln. He won Will County by about 53, 54%. So he was much higher in Illinois. And of course, in Southern Illinois, you had a lot more Douglas voters than you did in Northern Illinois, even though Douglas spent a lot of time and lived in Chicago. But Will County was very pro-Lincoln. Excuse me. Oddly enough, Joliet was less supportive of Lincoln. And why that is quite a debate. I've talked to many local historians about that issue, and we seem to kind of go back and forth on why that was. Excuse me. So Will County was very pro-Lincoln, but Joliet was less so. Unfortunately, the war does come, and there's a portrait of Lincoln in 1860. That is from 1860. This is before he grew his beard. A young girl had wrote to him saying he would look more distinguished with a beard. Lincoln has always been kind of identified as the common man, if you will, if you want to use that phrase. He grew up very poor. He was born in Kentucky. His mother dies. His mother, Nancy, dies when he's very young. His father was a failure at everything he ever did. He had a sister who died when he was young. Just a very kind of a hard scrabble existence. His father moved from Indiana to Illinois because he was trying to stay one step ahead of the debtors that he had. I've been to his house in Kentucky. It's a beautiful area. It's a national park today. Lincoln had a tremendous intellect. He also had a lot of compassion for other people growing up the way he did. He does become a lawyer. Many of you are familiar with this story. He has a very strong mentor in Springfield, Illinois, that mentors him in the law. He also is at the center of Illinois politics and becomes very well known in Illinois on the lawyer circuit. And he also comes into contact with a lot of politicians. As a matter of fact, his law office was right across the street from the Illinois State Capitol. So Lincoln becomes fairly wealthy as an attorney. He does have a very powerful intellect, and he has a very powerful logical mind. There's been a lot of books written by one gentleman named Blumenthal, who written about logic and reasoning in Lincoln and how he thought, his thought process. So he's a very fascinating guy. But the 1860 election, if you thought the 2020 election was contentious, and usually every presidential election is, I'm sure the 2024 one will be the same. But the 1860 election, it caused half the country to leave the United States. Very fascinating time. With the election of Lincoln in 1860, by mid-December 1860, South Carolina is the first state to succeed. That is in December. We call it succession winter. Between December of 1860 and April of 1861, 11 Southern states leave the Union. Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution strictly forbids any state from leaving the Union, although that's debated point sometimes by people like me who study the history of Civil War. My grandmother and grandfather, they both lived into the late 80s, early 90s. And when I was a kid, I asked my grandparents what they thought was a significant event in their life. And they always would say Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th, 1941. I always thought that was kind of interesting. They said that everything changed after Pearl Harbor, the war, the economy, then post-World War II. and of course they were from another country, but listening to people talk while you're alive about history who are much older than you, your grandparents are typically, 40, 50, 60 years older than when you're born. And so I was fortunate enough to hear them talk about life in America, and I always found that was fascinating. I was quite young when they both died. I was in my 20s, but it always kind of shocked me. They would say Pearl Harbor. When South Carolina and the Confederacy shot or fired upon Fort Sumter in April 1861, it was equivalent to that. Or even 9/11, which obviously 9/11 was done by a terrorist group, not a government necessarily. Like, Pearl Harbor was the Japanese naval forces attacking the United States military forces in Hawaii, of course, and other places. But what really solidified the Civil War and making it start was the firing upon Fort Sumter. A lot of Americans in the North saw that as betrayal. A lot of Southerners who supported secession, who felt that they had every right to form their own government. Why? For slavery. Lincoln was a detested person in many places in the South because he campaigned, as I mentioned, in 1860 about not allowing the expansion of slavery. And the slaveholding South, and of course the political elites and the wealthy elites, vehemently opposed that. They felt that it was against their constitutional rights to own property and capitalism and those kind of things. And Lincoln said over and over again that slavery was never meant to expand, for a lot of different reasons. So anyways, those are complex issues that certainly are very fascinating to address. But you have a relatively young country in 1860. They've only been around for 70 years. I mean, you look at other, countries around the world, we're a young country, still a relatively young country. And thankfully, we've only had one civil war in our history. Now, let's not have another one. But Will County was very outraged. There was a newspaper in Will County called the Sentinel. And if you ever look at their old transcripts and their old newspapers that you do at the Joliet Library downtown, which I have, and it's also online, but it was outrage. I mean, people were outraged that an American fort, American soldiers would come under fire by other Americans with the intent of killing them to gain their political will, or to have their political will. So again, 1861 was a very difficult year in American history. This is an old painting of the firing on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is right in Charleston, in South Carolina. I've been there numerous times. That's actually a very fascinating place to go and visit. They have a World War II aircraft carrier nearby. It's really a beautiful town, Charleston. Their historical society in Charleston actually has preserved different slave markets there. So it's a very fascinating place to look historically. And it's a very, very pretty city too. But this is still preserved today by National Park Service. You can visit it. You take a little ferry out there and you stay a couple hours. It's quite neat. You can see a lot of the damage that the firing did on. Of course, it was attacked throughout the war by the United States Navy. And of course, when the Confederacy acquired Fort Sumter, it did surrender. A guy named Anderson surrendered the fort. Admiral Doubleday was there too, who is erroneously credited with starting baseball. But when they raised the rebel flag at Fort Sumter in April 1861, wow, it really was pouring gas on a fire. And immediately, the reason why I bring this up is immediately Will County responded to that. Now, during the Civil War, over 3,700 young men do serve in Will County, or from Will County, do serve in the United States military, United States Army, primarily. The first man to volunteer was Frederick Bartleson. He's a very fascinating guy. He's a Will County state's attorney. He's a young guy. He's about 30 years old at the time. He's elected in 1858. Today, Glasgow is our attorney, the district attorney. And Frederick Bartleson was a very young, ambitious attorney. He was born in Ohio. He was educated in Pennsylvania. And during the war, 600 Will County soldiers out of those 280,000 Illinoisans, but 600 Will County soldiers out of that 3,700 from our county, there's 102 counties in Illinois, died in the Civil War. That is a tremendous casualty rate. And that's not wounded, that's died. Many died from the disease, many died from combat. There were 28 Will County residents who died at Andersonville. Andersonville, I've been there, that's in Georgia. It was near the end of the war, and the South could not feed its own army, let alone prisoners. And basically, it was a 28-acre prison, Andersonville was, and they stuffed about 30,000 soldiers in there. It was just a very chaotic place. And they starved to death. Most of the Will County soldiers, the 3,700 Will County soldiers, served in the 20th and 100th Illinois Infantry Regiments. I will speak of other regiments, but those are the two primary ones. The 20th Illinois was formed in the summer of 1861. And as I said, the first volunteer was Frederick Bartleson. The 20th Illinois had a lot of Will County soldiers in it, but it also had a lot of soldiers from around the area. Remember, it's a very chaotic time. Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers after the firing on Fort Sumter. Most of these folks were not soldiers. Many of them were not even in militia units. They were driven by patriotism. They were driven by outrage at the succession. They were driven by a desire to right those wrongs. Some were against slavery to the point they were abolitionists. Many Illinoisans did not support slavery, but they didn't necessarily advocate against it. Slavery is a very, very interesting topic to discuss in the 1860s, 1850s, especially in Illinois. There's very few people who live actually in Illinois. We actually had black codes for a long time in Illinois. African Americans were not very welcomed into Illinois at that time. And we had a very small population of African Americans, primarily some in Chicago and some were in the Quincy area. There were very few African Americans in Will County in 1860. The 20th Illinois was formed in 1861. It does serve all the way to 1865. There were about 1,300 soldiers, which is a fairly large number to be in one regiment throughout the war. Of course, that number ebbs and flows. And look at the casualty rate. Over 331 members of the 20th Illinois Regiment, Infantry Regiment, are killed during the war. The first major battles they were in 20th Illinois, which was formed in Joliet, as you know, was Fort Donelson, which is in Tennessee, and that was commanded by Grant. Fort Donelson was considered to be almost impregnable. It's on the Tennessee River, and it was the fort was defeated, and a large number of Confederate soldiers were captured, and it gave Grant a great victory and really propelled him in front of Lincoln's eyes as a good commander, which he was. And then also in April 1862, the first real, for lack of a better word, the first real bloody battle of the Civil War is Shiloh, in Tennessee. Some of you may have been there. It overlooks the Tennessee River. It's a real beautiful area. It is a national park today. And Shiloh was really a place where you had a large force of Union soldiers under the command of Grant. You had a lot of Illinois soldiers there, and he went up against a very good general named Johnson. Johnson actually wounded and dies in this battle. He's a Confederate soldier. He's a West Point grad like Grant is. Also, Sherman's there with Grant. They formed that very powerful partnership and friendship. And again, remember earlier I said Dan Higgins. He's a soldier. He's caught up. Death is at his side every day. Shiloh showed to the United States that this was going to be a bloody, bloody Civil War. That this, was going to be a 3-month war, and we're going to whip those Yankees, or we're going to whip those Rebs, and all that naivety went out the door. Shiloh proved it was going to be a long, tough war, and that it was going to take a long time to defeat the Confederacy because they were going to fight, and then the North was going to fight. So Shiloh proved that, and a lot of Will County soldiers were there. You know, again, we have to listen to those soldiers. Those soldiers are very much alive. You know, they've all passed on, of course. As I mentioned earlier, Dan Higgins lived until 1926. But they lived through us. We tell their stories. Just like in your family, you tell the stories of people who've passed. You tell the stories of people who are alive. And they have a story to tell. You have a story to tell. And it's a wonderful story. You know, where you're from, where you lived, your struggles, what did you overcome? You know, what challenges did you have? Try to think yourself as a 19, 20, 21-year-old. And here you are, never left Lockport or Joliet or Frankfort your whole life. Maybe you went to the big city of Chicago once. And here you are in Tennessee, watching your friends that you grew up with die right in front of you. You know, and how do you come to reckon with that? And conversely, what are you going to do? They don't give you a musket because it looks good. They give it to you because they want you to kill. So you have to line up another human being in your sights and kill him. Because if you don't, he might kill you or he might kill your friend. That's war. That's combat. And that's what these soldiers were faced with every day. So Shiloh, it was a 2-day battle, was an absolute bloodbath, for lack of a better word. Our very own Frederick Barlison loses his left arm. He credits a young surgeon with saving his life. He had first been given up on because of loss of blood. He was in shock and he was kind of going in and out of consciousness. And his left arm was mangled. And he grabbed the doctor as he walked by the medical tent that he was in. And he grabbed him and he kind of held on to him from the story that I was told. And, you know, he told him, you know, I'm alive, you know, keep me alive. And the doctor, who had kind of given him up for dead, realized, you know, the will to live in this man. You know, he did amputate his left arm, and back then they would put a vise on your arm, and they would clamp down on that vise, high and low, and they would cut it off. Usually die of infection if he didn't die of shock. And Frederick Barlison survived his wound. He's a very fascinating guy because he does come back to command another regiment. So also from Plainfield is the McAllister Battery. This is led by Edward McAllister. This is a militia unit. They were actually formed in 1855. We didn't have National Guards in Illinois or any other state in the 1850s. They were militia units, and they typically were formed in local communities. They were paid by local communities if they were paid. Typically, they made their own uniforms. There really wasn't a National Guard kind of structure in states back then, especially in Illinois. Some states that had military academies, like Virginia, had more what we might think of as National Guard units, but not in Illinois. For those of you who are familiar with Plainfield, this is actually right near where Route 126 is and 59, right in that area, believe it or not. We have a map of where he trained. He trained not too far from the DuPage River. He owned a farm, and he also owned a blacksmith shop. So McAllister was doing fairly well in his life for that time. He was a little bit older man, but the McAllister Battery became very famous during the Civil War. And they were attached to the 20th Illinois, and then later they were attached to the 100th Illinois. And they were given big cannons. Most infantry cannons at the time had 12-pounders. They were called Napoleons. They were given 24-pounders. So that's a big cannon. And it takes a lot of men, and it's very difficult to maneuver those cannons. But it kind of shows you how good of a battery is usually a battery has 6 cannons and about maybe 100 men that tend to those batteries. They're a team of cannons. So McAllister was a very famous guy from the area. We actually have his uniform at the Joliet Area Historical Museum. It's right actually next to the flag. Whoop, whoop, whoop. There he is. Kind of distinguished looking guy. Maybe he looks like a JJC, maybe, huh? Back in the day. He's got the goatee going there. He's got the kind of the white hair, the real stern look to him. He actually lived a long time. And again, we have his uniform at the Joliet Area Historical Museum. It's on display there. He does look like a very stern taskmaster kind of guy. This is Bartleson here, and you can see his left arm has been amputated. This was taken in Joliet. This is the monument to the 20th Illinois Infantry at Shiloh, which again is in Tennessee. I took this picture many years ago. It was in the springtime. So, and again, this is a picture of Bartleson. Real quickly about Bartleson, give you a little history of him. Again, he's killed in action at Kennesaw Mountain in Georgia on June 23rd, 1864. He was on his horse. He was. I think he made a mistake. He usually, most officers, especially by 1864, and experienced officers like him, would dismount. The Confederacy was trying to maneuver into position, and he got on his horse to ride to the front of where his men were to get a better look. The emotion and the adrenaline of the moment, and he made a mistake, and a Confederate soldier put a round right through his neck. All indications he died right in front of the 100th Illinois, and also attached to the 21st Indiana Regiment. And when he fell, they talked that he was shot through the neck. He did live a little bit longer, but not much. They probably hit a jugular. He lived about for a few minutes, and he was trying to talk and he couldn't talk. So he died a very, very horrific death. Bartleson was a very, very patriotic man, and he believed in his cause. Again, he is from Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, he's born in Ohio. He lives early his adulthood in Pennsylvania. He does become Illinois. Illinois is the frontier in some ways at that time. And ambitious young people would move to Illinois. And he is elected the state's attorney. And he's buried in Joliet at Oakwood Cemetery in the summer of 1864. And after Shiloh, let's progress back into the 100th Illinois. After Shiloh in Tennessee, as the Civil War progressed, and it was going to be a long, hard war, Will County and the politicians in Will County wanted to form just a regiment of people from primarily Will County. Lincoln calls for another volunteer. This time he calls for 300,000 volunteers. After Shiloh, it's obviously this is going to be a long war. And so Will County wants to form its own regiment. It does. It forms the 100th Illinois Infantry Regiment. It was a very good regiment. They train in in Will County in Camp Irwin, which is on the east side of Joliet, not too far from where Route 30, if you've ever been in that area, not really that far from where Joliet kind of goes up into New Lenox, not far from actually Providence High School, believe it or not. The old Silver Cross Hospital over in that area, if you're familiar with Joliet. If you're not familiar with Joliet, you probably have no clue where that's at. Well, then Google it. You'll be fine. Bartleson's an interesting guy. I have a lot of respect for the man. We have his sword at the Will County Historical Museum. Here's what he says. He could stay out of the war after he loses his left arm, and yet he volunteers again. Think about that. I mean, this is not a man who likes war, but he feels very committed to what he's doing. And here's a quote that he has. And he's also married. Doesn't have any kids, but he's married. "I have still an arm left for my country," his right arm, "and she can have that too if needed be." Colonel Bartleson was a major at the time, and he says this in the summer of 1862. He helps recruit this new infantry regiment, and then when it comes time to lead it, he's the one who volunteers to lead it. He is promoted to colonel. Think about that. Boy, you lose your left arm in April 1862. And later you're going to, when you recover, barely recover from that wound, then you're going to re-enlist for a combat position. Not only did he re-enlist, he could have been a quartermaster or something like, it could have been a, whatever, but he wants to be in a frontline unit. Later, the 100th Illinois saw a lot of combat, just like the 20th Illinois did. Just to give you an idea where they fought. About 1,100 men were in the 100th Illinois. At any given time, there was not that many, though, as anywhere near that number. Sometimes I've seen where late in the war, there was roughly 300 that were able to even be in frontline duty. And again, these are young men. These are men in their teens and 20s. It just shows you the rate of combat casualties, injuries, disease. Okay. If you are familiar with Civil War history, the siege of Chattanooga in Tennessee was a very important place. The American Army, Federal Army, was trying to cut the Confederacy in three. Keep Lee in the north and Virginia and Maryland primarily. Keep the Confederacy in bottled up along the Mississippi River, along a place called Vicksburg, which will fall in July of 1863, and then also keeping them bottled up in Georgia. So they keep them from working together, those three armies of the Confederacy, which did work over time. But look at these casualties: 12,500 federal soldiers, U.S. American soldiers, in the siege of the Chattanooga and the Battle of Missionary Ridge, which was a very famous charge. If you've ever heard the Wisconsin State song, On Wisconsin, or if you've ever been to a Wisconsin football game, On Wisconsin, that's where that came from. As a matter of fact, Douglas MacArthur's father was awarded the Medal of Honor for Missionary Ridge. When he said On Wisconsin, so actually it came from Douglas MacArthur's father. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, which I mentioned earlier, was where Bartleson was killed. There's a beautiful monument to the Illinois soldiers who fought at Kennesaw Mountain. It's a really beautiful area if you've ever been there. It's right outside of Atlanta, Georgia. The Confederate Southern Army under Bragg did not want to give up Atlanta. Atlanta was a major railroad hub, and to lose Atlanta would have had devastating effects on the South's ability to fight. And they do lose Atlanta, and of course Sherman and his famous March to the Sea. Unfortunately, Bartleson is killed on June 23rd, 1864. And the succeeding officers from Wilmington, Illinois, Charles Hammond, he's actually buried in Wilmington, for those of you who might know. He was actually an abolitionist as well. I later found out. I'm doing some research on Charles Hammond. He was a very respected man. He does take over. He is a captain. He does take over. I'm sorry, he's a major. And he does take over. And he is respected. But after Kennesaw Mountain, the 100th Illinois is really depleted. It's a combat unit. It's very experienced. It's very respected by Sherman, but it is a depleted unit. And quite frankly, Will County has very few young and middle-aged men who would be able to replace those soldiers who are killed or missing or captured during 1864. We really were literally running out of people to fight in the war. Excuse me. Therefore, later in the war, the 100th Illinois was sent to guard Nashville, which becomes actually a pretty contentious place under a guy named Thomas, General George Thomas of the Union Army. Nashville actually became a staging point. It was actually later attacked by the Confederacy. And the 100th Illinois once again assumed a combat role, even though it was supposed to be a place where they were just going to be tentatively used to rearm, refit, and retrain new recruits. That didn't happen. Very fascinating talk. I hope everyone's enjoying this. Let me give you a quick photo of Bartleson's gravesite. There it is. And that's at Oakwood Cemetery. It had a big procession in June of 1864 when his body was brought back to Will County and Joliet. These are obviously Civil War reenactors. And if I took this picture here, I did not take the picture on the right, but I took this picture on the left. This is Memorial Day a couple years ago. And there is Burleson's monument right there. And of course, this is a reenacting, federal Civil War Union Army reenactors. And as you can see, there it is right there at Oakwood Cemetery. So very, very neat area. There's also another gentleman that's buried there that I'll talk about in a second. Here are some of their battles that the 100th Illinois fought in. I mean, these are these were large combat battles. I mean, if you think of like World War II, like Normandy or something along those lines, the Guadalcanal where the Marines had fought and the Army had fought in the Pacific against the Japanese. This is equivalent to those kind of battles. Perryville's in Kentucky, as you can see, Stones River, Chickamauga, which is in Georgia, Chattanooga, Kennesaw Mountain, which is outside of Atlanta, and then of course Nashville. So they had an extensive record. So those that were recruited in 1862 to fight in the 100th Illinois saw tremendous combat. So when you think of Dan Higgins, it kind of gives new meaning to what he said in 1911. We are the product of a glorious future. We give that to you, not to us. We're aging. We're aging men. We fought for that for you. That future is for you. And they fought it with their blood and their friends dying during the Civil War. Here is this is Chickamauga. This is it's actually a Native American name. This is in Georgia. The 100th Illinois was devastated at Chickamauga. As a matter of fact, Bartleson was captured there. I took this picture here. This is a big battlefield, I should say. It's National Park Service runs it today. Beautiful area. And this is the monument to 100th Illinois. This gentleman here, Wood, he was a general. He misinterpreted an order and started pulling troops out of this area, thinking they were needed elsewhere. And right at that time, a very famous Confederate general named Longstreet launched about 15,000 of his very experienced soldiers and just collapsed the 100th Illinois. As a matter of fact, the 100th Illinois is right in the center of the blunt of that attack. And it was a mess. These were very experienced combat soldiers. They were very motivated. They had great unit cohesion in 100th Illinois. A lot of these soldiers were friends. They had suffered war every day for years now. By 1863, I'm sorry. And Chickamauga was in the fall of 1863. And this unit, 100th Illinois Infantry Regiment, was right in the center of this attack. And that's where this monument's at, by the way, right in the center of where that happened. There's a really good book that just came out in Chickamauga, written by an Illinoisan named Dave Powell, Powell, if anybody's interested. He just wrote a really good book on the Battle of Chickamauga, and 100th Illinois is quite extensively listed in there. But this general here, he made a mistake, and that happens. But you know what? Guess what happens in war? When you make a mistake, people die. You have to make a decision in war: who lives and who dies. Simple as that. Bartleson had to make that decision. Every day, these soldiers have to make that decision: who lives and who dies. Dan Higgins had to make that every day: who lives and who dies. And unfortunately, this general, who's a good general, he made a mistake, misunderstood it. So I've got a few more slides here I want to get to, and then I'll take some questions and answerings. This is Captain Augustus Hill, very fascinating guy. He was a Will County attorney. He knew Bartleson very well. He was an abolitionist. We believe he was a main person on the Underground Railroad through Joliet because of the Des Plaines River and also the Kankakee River in Wilmington. We know that he was very involved in the abolitionist movement. We have a lot of records on Augustus Hill, Captain Augustus Hill. He's got a cool name, right? Augusta. I always like that name, Augusta Hill. He was a very fascinating guy. He served in a very elite unit. That is the 8th Illinois Cavalry. They were in the Army of the Potomac. They were never attached to the Western Theater, where the 100th Illinois, the 20th Illinois were always in what they call the Western Theater. The 8th Illinois was a very, very good unit. It was formed in St. Charles, Illinois, under the tutelage of a man who was a representative named Farnsworth. He was a U.S. representative from Illinois. He was very, very good friends with Lincoln. The 8th Illinois Cavalry, made up primarily of abolitionists. There was about 500 men in that regiment, the 8th Illinois. A lot of them were from DuPage County, Kane County, and they also had some from Will County. And Augustus Hill is one of them. He fought in many of the battles. He was a superb cavalry soldier. And he was at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was right when the battle started. There was a guy named Marcellus Jones, who was a lieutenant. He took the first shot at Gettysburg. As a matter of fact, that painting right above my shoulder, I don't know if it's very clear, but that's the painting of the first shot at Gettysburg in my house. And Augustus Hill was someone who saw a lot of combat. He survives this combat throughout the war. He served under a general named John Buford. John Buford was a West Point grad. He was very respected, but John Buford was very aggressive, and he led his men through very hard campaigns, and the men responded to it. But they were very dedicated to defeating the Confederate cavalry, and certainly John Buford was their leader. They respected him throughout their life. And Augustus Hill was very much a part of the 8th Illinois Cavalry. I can't overstate how good of a cavalry it was. Now, late in the war, you had 180,000 African Americans who fought in the Union Army. Unfortunately, there was a lot of discrimination against them, and one of the discriminating rules of the United States Army at the time was that Black soldiers could not be officers. Again, it was a segregated military all the way through World War II, believe it or not. And so they were looking for officers who were abolitionists, who had experience both in combat and in training soldiers. And so Augustus Hill volunteered to be an officer in which USCT stands for United States Colored Troops. And so he was an officer late in the war for a regiment, the 1st Regiment of USCT. That's quite a sign of respect by the United States Army to put him in that position to be one of the officers in the very 1st Regiment of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. It was much later in the war. The USCT had been around for a while by then. He was elected Will County State's Attorney in 1868. He does survive the war, as I said. He survived a lot of combat, by the way, and I mean hard combat, in Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia. He was chasing Jeb Stuart around for years. The 8th Illinois had a very high casualty rate, and they were all Illinoisans, too, in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Very fascinating group. Augustus Hill, he's a fascinating guy. He really is. He's elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1888. He only was elected for one term. He was a Will County State's Attorney, so he has a job that Bartleson had, and of course today Glasgow is our state's attorney. Very fascinating guy. He dies around 1902, sorry. He's buried in Oakwood Cemetery. He's right near Bartleson. He was friends with Bartleson. He knew Bartleson. They both were attorneys. I believe that Augustus Hill was actually a defense attorney at the time. So may even had a few court cases against each other, but they were friends. They knew each other. And again, he does die in 1902. He was about 70 years old at the time. And there he is right there. This is a picture. I use this one because this is a picture a little bit later in the war. It was taken in Joliet. A lot of soldiers took these kind of portraits. And then there he is. This gentleman here is his brother-in-law. He married his sister. And this is early in the war. This is 1862. And there's Augustus Hill right there. This gentleman here does not survive the war. I forget where he died, but he does not survive the war. So very interesting. Yeah, this is the one in Joliet. This is the photo in Joliet as well. So this was taken in 1862. And there's
Dennis, I just want to let you know we have about 5 minutes till 1, just so you know. And
okay, great.
if participants want to start putting questions in the chat, please go ahead.
All right, I'm almost done. I've got about another hour. No.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm just about to wrap it up. Here's the 8th Illinois Cavalry Monument at Gettysburg. And boy, if you've ever been there, it's a beautiful monument. This is a field behind it. This is the Lutheran Seminary right over here. If you've ever seen the movie Gettysburg, this is where a lot of combat took place. The 8th Illinois fought a delay in action for about 2 hours. And there was a lot of combat there. And they went up against some of the best soldiers the Confederacy had. And they delayed them, allowing for the Union Army to come into Gettysburg and defend the town. So they bought a lot of time, and Augustus Hill was there. Real quickly, I have to give a shout out to he was an adjunct history professor at JJC. He also worked full-time in the media, and that's Fred Harris. He actually had a relative who was in the 100th Illinois, and that's Harvey Chamberlain. He was from Lockport. He did survive the war. He was a blacksmith, and Fred Harris did a lot of research on him. And when he found out that I was a Civil War historian, he gave me a lot of this information. I looked him up, and very fascinating guy. Look at that term of service, though. Almost 3 years of combat. This man, Harvey Chamberlain from Lockport, saw a heck of a lot of combat, especially in that. Yeah, he's in Company C. Company C was usually in the lead company. It was usually a little bit older men who had a lot of experience in Company C and Company J, I believe, were usually in the lead elements of the 100th Illinois. Means they got a tough job. All right, I want to finish my presentation with this quote from Dan Higgins. This is the second part of his quote in 1911 in Lockport. All these veterans of the 100th Illinois and the 20th Illinois met in Lockport that year for the last time. They're aging. Look at what he says. And comrades, our hearts are full of gratitude that we have lived to see the country united. It didn't fall apart. Lincoln was right, to bind up the wounds of the country. His Gettysburg Address. So, he says, let's rejoice that we are here, and let the remaining years of our lives be devoted to giving and to getting as much enjoyment as we can out of life. That is my sincere wish. And you know what? That's my sincere wish for all of you that participated in my presentation today. That these folks aren't people from the past. They're still alive. Yes, they've passed on. But just like people you love, just like people you care about that you haven't seen or maybe have passed on. Those are sad things. Dan Higgins saw his friends die. Dan Higgins had to kill other men in combat. Those aren't things that he thought were good things. What were the good things he thought? That the Union stayed together, the Constitution stayed together, that the terrible things that we allowed to let exist, like slavery, would end, and that maybe over time, the country would be united. And so he says, let's rejoice in that. We're alive. Who better to appreciate life than someone who's almost lost it? Talk to a cancer survivor. What are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you the same thing. Let us rejoice in life. Let us rejoice in what we have. What a wonderful human being, Dan Higgins. And so I leave you with that. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. I will take questions if you have any. Thank you, Amy, for having me. And thank you for the 5-minute warning. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis. This was like an absolutely fantastic presentation, and to end on such a beautiful quote was just so meaningful. So thank you so much. We do have a question. Let me go ahead and take a look here. From John Lyons, he's asking, could you tell us about Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery and on African Americans?
That is a very good question and a very complex one. Lincoln hated slavery. He saw slavery when he was a young man, when he went to New Orleans. He was a young man, and his father was a farmer, not a very successful one. And he and a friend, instead of shipping the grain that they harvested that year, to save the expense, he and his friend actually took a barge, you think of that, down to New Orleans. And Lincoln saw, as a young man in his early 20s, he saw a slave auction take place, and he saw a young woman being separated from her children. And she was in her early 20s. And Lincoln saw this firsthand, and he was deeply affected by how horrible that was. Lincoln did not support slavery, but also Lincoln, as a politician, did not want the expansion of slavery. And he thought that in the 1850s, Congress started passing laws like the Fugitive Slave Act and things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, things like that, where Congress was starting to restrict the rights of people who opposed slavery. In other words, if you were in the Underground Railroad, you could be arrested. And if you were in Illinois, you could be arrested for helping a runaway slave. It's a little more complex than that. So Lincoln was very much opposed to slavery. The contradiction was that Lincoln did not run for election in 1860 to demand that a constitutional amendment be passed to outlaw it. Lincoln was a very pragmatic man, and Lincoln knew that wasn't going to work. But Lincoln, during the war, at his first opportunity after the Battle of Antietam, which is September 1862, was a victory for the Union Army over Lee in Maryland, Lincoln took that opportunity and said, now we're going to have the Emancipation Proclamation. Anywhere where the Union Army is in power, slavery will no longer be allowed to exist in that area. And that was the first time in American history where a sitting president, after the Constitution was ratified in 1790, of course, a sitting president says, we're not going to allow slavery to exist where it once existed. And that's very important. And his general at the time told him, a guy named McClellan, said, you can't do that. American soldiers won't fight to end slavery. They're only fighting to keep the Union together. And Lincoln called his bluff. And he said, no, this is a moral debate now. It's not just a war about keeping the Union together. It's also a war about ending slavery. And Lincoln was very pragmatic, and he kept a lot of those thoughts to himself. So Lincoln's thoughts on slavery were very complicated. I always tell people, name another white person in the 1860s with the power that Lincoln had that did more to end slavery. You can't find anybody. Was he a flawed man? Of course he was. Was he a product of his times? Yes. Lincoln had said things that he shouldn't have said in the 1858 debates against Douglas, but I think Lincoln was, in my opinion, people disagree, I think Lincoln was one of the few political geniuses. He was a genius, in my opinion. He was a prodigy, like a Mozart kind of a person. He was a political genius, in my opinion. Yeah.
This is an interesting question from Jasmine Venegas, and sure. I think it kind of goes in hand with what you're talking about right now. She says, hi, Dennis. I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on why Joliet was less supportive of President Lincoln compared to Will County, even though both are very close to each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. Will County was very pro-Lincoln in the 1860 and 1864 election. As a matter of fact, in the 1864 election, Lincoln got more votes. Troy Township, which isn't too far from here, which is today Shorewood, something like 80% of people in Troy Township voted for Lincoln. Joliet actually was not very supportive of Lincoln in 1860 and 1864 election. Why that is a very difficult question. We have bounced that around a lot. Although they did vote for him, typically, I see that Robert Kuzma is there. Typically, the debate has to do with, it could be economic. There was the railroads were starting to become very popular in Joliet. There was a lot of commerce from the South in terms of wealth that kind of indirectly came through Will County and in Joliet. You also had a growing immigrant base in Will County that may have been more supportive of Lincoln. So there are a lot of debates about why Joliet wasn't as supportive of Lincoln as Will County was. Also you had two different newspapers in Joliet. So you really had more of a conservative kind of base of people who did not necessarily agree with more of his forward thinking. So it might have been just kind of the politics of people who lived in Joliet at the time, a little bit more conservative. Not a very good answer, by the way. I've struggled with this answer a lot. There is a real expert in Will County in the Civil War, Bob Kuzma, who's here today. He and I are friends, actually. He's an attorney in Will County, in our area. And he's actually spoke on 100th Illinois and Will County Civil War. And he and I have had lunch many times, and I have him come speak to my classes and stuff. So it's a difficult question, but I appreciate you asking it, Jasmine, because I wish I had a better answer for you. But it was typically a pretty conservative town at the time in how they supported, did not necessarily support Lincoln outright. But then again, a lot of people from Joliet still served in the military. I mean, one of the great leaders of the 100th Illinois was Frederick Bartleson, who was an attorney, and a prosecutor, Will County State's attorney. So very cool. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Dennis. There's a lot of just positive feedback in the chat saying excellent presentation, engaging as always. So thank you so much for giving, this presentation. I know I learned so much, and I just love to know this connection to the Will County area and the Civil War. And especially like you said, these people are no longer living, but they do live through us. And the reason why we're here is because of their past and their history. So I find that really meaningful. And thank you so much, Dennis.
Amy, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all that you folks do in the library. This has been a tough year for all of us because of COVID, and I want to thank everybody who came to listen to the presentation. And again, I want to thank for all the good work that you folks do in the library, because we're very committed to our students, we're very committed to our college, and we're very committed to our history in Will County. So thank you all for coming and taking time out of your busy days to hear what I had to say about Will County and the Civil War. A very fascinating topic, and I hope in some ways that that it helps you understand your community as well, and who came before us and what.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.